Daniel Parker arrived at the airport nearly 3 hours before departure, hoping extra time would make the trip less stressful for his mother. Experience had taught him that traveling with someone living with Parkinson's disease required patience, planning, and a willingness to adapt to unexpected challenges. He pushed Margaret Parker's wheelchair slowly across the polished terminal floor, careful to avoid rushing over uneven seams that made her body jolt. Margaret, 67 years old, sat quietly with her hands resting in her lap, though they trembled continuously despite the medication she had taken before leaving home. Her silver-gray hair was neatly brushed into a short bob, and she wore a light blue cardigan over a modest floral dress with comfortable walking shoes that Daniel had carefully chosen because they were easy to slip on and off during security checks. Around her shoulders rested a soft knitted scarf that Lily had insisted Grandma wear because airport terminals were always cold. 7-year-old Lily skipped beside the wheelchair with a small backpack almost as large as her tiny frame. Clutched tightly in one hand was her favorite stuffed rabbit, its ears bent from years of hugs and adventures. Every few steps she looked up at her grandmother with an encouraging smile that seemed capable of brightening even the busiest terminal. Daniel admired his daughter for never seeing Parkinson's before seeing the person. To Lily, Grandma was still the woman who read bedtime stories, baked cinnamon cookies before her hands became too unsteady, and sang gentle lullabies on rainy afternoons. The terminal overflowed with travelers dragging rolling suitcases, checking departure screens, sipping coffee, and hurrying toward distant gates. Loud announcements echoed overhead while children laughed, phones rang, and conversations blended into a constant wave of noise. Amid the crowd, Daniel felt painfully aware of the curious glances that followed them. Some strangers offered sympathetic smiles, but many looked away almost immediately, uncertain how to react to Margaret's shaking hands and slow movements. Others stared openly before pretending they had not been watching. They stopped near a row of seats overlooking the runway. Airplanes taxied gracefully across the concrete while ground crews worked with practiced precision. Daniel helped his mother transfer carefully from the wheelchair cushion into a slightly more comfortable seat. The movement took longer than it once had. Margaret's legs hesitated before obeying, and her balance wavered for a brief moment until Daniel steadied her arm. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, her words emerging slowly. "Everything takes so long." Daniel knelt beside her, looking directly into her eyes instead of at the trembling hands she tried unsuccessfully to hide beneath the cardigan. "You never have to apologize," he said softly. "We're exactly where we need to be." Margaret nodded, though sadness lingered behind her gentle smile. Lily climbed into the seat beside her grandmother and proudly unzipped her backpack. "I packed snacks," she announced. "Crackers, apple slices, and the chocolate cookies Grandpa's recipe makes." Margaret chuckled quietly, the sound faint but genuine. "You remembered my favorite." "Of course," Lily replied. "Grandmas always get the best snacks." Daniel watched the exchange with gratitude. Since his father's passing years earlier, Margaret had struggled not only with illness but also with loneliness. Parkinson's had gradually stolen pieces of the confident music teacher she once was. The energetic woman who conducted children's choirs and organized school performances now worried about holding a cup without spilling it. Yet Lily somehow reached past every symptom and spoke directly to the grandmother still living beneath the disease. A sudden tremor shook Margaret's right hand more violently than usual. The bottle of water resting loosely between her fingers slipped free, bounced once against the floor, and rolled several feet across the waiting area before stopping near another group of passengers. Daniel immediately stood. "I'll get it." Before he reached the bottle, a middle-aged woman frowned, gathered her handbag, and quietly motioned for her husband to move farther away. They collected their luggage without saying anything and chose seats several rows down the terminal. Another traveler glanced briefly toward Margaret before returning to his phone with an expression of visible discomfort. Margaret noticed. Her shoulders sank. "I didn't mean." Daniel picked up the bottle and returned, placing it gently back into the side pocket of the wheelchair instead of her hands. "It was an accident," he said firmly. "But people don't always understand." She lowered her gaze toward the polished floor, embarrassed by attention she never wanted. Lily reached over and wrapped both small hands around one of her grandmother's trembling ones. "I still like sitting next to you." Margaret blinked back tears. "I know, sweetheart." Daniel checked the departure board once again. Their flight represented far more than a simple journey. After months of consultations, referrals, paperwork, and financial sacrifices, Margaret had finally been accepted into a specialized neurological treatment program in another state. The therapy would not reverse Parkinson's disease, but doctors believed it might slow the progression of symptoms and improve her daily independence. Daniel had emptied much of his savings because he refused to give up on giving his mother every opportunity for a better quality of life. When the boarding announcement finally echoed through the terminal, passengers immediately formed a long line near the gate. Daniel stood behind the wheelchair handles and gently positioned Margaret to join the pre-boarding group for passengers needing additional assistance. As they approached the gate, conversations around them softened. Several travelers glanced toward Margaret's trembling arms before exchanging quiet looks with one another. Daniel recognized those expressions instantly. They were the same looks he had encountered in grocery stores, restaurants, waiting rooms, and countless other public places since his mother's diagnosis. Margaret noticed them too. She folded her hands together as best she could, trying unsuccessfully to make the tremors less visible while whispering almost to herself, "I hope I don't cause trouble." Daniel rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The cabin gradually filled with the familiar sounds of an airplane preparing for departure. Suitcases bumped against overhead bins, seat belts clicked into place, and passengers searched for their assigned rows while exchanging polite smiles or impatient sighs. Daniel Parker stood in the aisle beside his mother, carefully helping Margaret step from the boarding wheelchair into her seat. Every movement required patience. Parkinson's had made simple tasks complicated, and the narrow space between the seats offered little room to maneuver. Margaret gripped the armrest with trembling hands while Daniel supported her elbow, giving her enough time to find her balance without feeling rushed. "I'm okay," she whispered, though her shaking legs suggested otherwise. "I know you are," Daniel replied gently. "Take all the time you need." Lily had already climbed into the middle seat, hugging her stuffed rabbit against her chest. She watched every movement with quiet concern, ready to help in the small ways only a child could. When her grandmother finally settled into the window seat with a relieved sigh, Lily reached over and carefully straightened the cardigan sleeve that had become twisted during the transfer. "There," she said proudly. "Now you're comfortable." Margaret smiled warmly. "You always take care of me." Lily grinned. "That's my job." Daniel stored their carry-on bag in the overhead compartment before taking the aisle seat. He double-checked that his mother's medication pouch remained inside the seat pocket where he could reach it quickly if needed. He also placed a small travel pillow behind her lower back because sitting upright for several hours often caused stiffness and discomfort. Every detail had been planned long before they left home. Living with Parkinson's had taught him that preparation could prevent unnecessary stress. Passengers continued boarding, filling the remaining seats row by row. Several glanced toward Margaret as they walked past. Her hands trembled continuously in her lap, and occasionally her head shook slightly with movements she could not control. Most people looked away after only a second, but Daniel noticed the expressions. Some reflected sympathy, others showed uncertainty, a few revealed open discomfort. A middle-aged businessman reached the row directly behind them. He paused after noticing Margaret and frowned before looking toward an approaching flight attendant. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Is there another seat available farther forward?" The flight attendant smiled politely. "May I ask if there's an issue with your assigned seat?" He hesitated. "I'd just prefer somewhere else if possible." She glanced briefly toward Margaret, immediately understanding the situation. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied professionally. "The flight is nearly full." The man sighed, clearly disappointed, before taking his assigned seat behind them. A few rows ahead, another passenger whispered something to her companion while glancing back toward Margaret. They spoke softly enough that the words couldn't be heard, but the repeated looks were impossible to miss. Margaret lowered her eyes toward her trembling hands. "I make people uncomfortable." Daniel turned toward her immediately. "No, Mom, they're afraid. They simply don't understand what Parkinson's looks like." She offered a sad smile that never reached her eyes. "It still hurts." Daniel wished he could disagree. No matter how many times he reminded her that strangers' opinions did not define her worth, their reactions still left invisible scars. Illness changed more than the body. It quietly challenged confidence, independence, and dignity every single day. As passengers settled into their seats, a flight attendant with neatly tied brown hair approached their row carrying a warm, welcoming smile. Her name tag read Emily Carter. Instead of speaking only to Daniel, she knelt beside Margaret so they were at eye level. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Parker, she said gently. Margaret blinked in surprise. You know, my name. Emily smiled. I checked our special assistants list before boarding. I wanted to make sure I greeted you properly. The simple gesture immediately changed the atmosphere. She had not introduced Margaret as a medical case. She had introduced her as a person. It's nice, to meet you. It's my pleasure. Emily noticed Margaret struggling with the seat belt. The trembling in her hands made guiding the buckle difficult, and after several attempts she quietly stopped trying. Without drawing attention from nearby passengers, Emily spoke softly. May I help? Margaret hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Emily gently fastened the belt with calm efficiency, never rushing, never making Margaret feel embarrassed. There we are, she said cheerfully. Perfect. Thank you. You're very welcome. Lily watched with wide eyes. You're really nice. Emily laughed softly. I think your grandma deserves kindness. Lily nodded enthusiastically. I think so too. Daniel felt tension leave his shoulders for the first time since arriving at the airport. Throughout countless doctor visits, hospitals, pharmacies, and public outings, he had learned how much difference genuine compassion could make. Emily wasn't performing a grand act. She was simply treating Margaret with ordinary respect, something surprisingly rare during difficult travel days. A few minutes later Emily returned carrying a small paper cup fitted with a flexible straw. I thought drinking might be easier this way. Margaret accepted it carefully. You noticed. I try to notice the little things. The straw allowed Margaret to drink without worrying about spilling water because of her tremors. Such a small adjustment spared her unnecessary embarrassment. Daniel smiled gratefully. Thank you for thinking ahead. Emily shrugged modestly. It's part of taking care of people. Rather than hurrying away, she remained beside the row for another moment. Were you always from Chicago? She asked Margaret conversationally. Margaret shook her head. No, I taught music in Ohio for 35 years. Emily's face brightened. A music teacher. That's wonderful. Margaret nodded slowly. I loved children's choirs. What was your favorite song to teach? Margaret paused as memories replaced anxiety. You are my sunshine. Every first grade class wanted to sing louder than the last. Emily laughed. I can imagine that. So much energy. For several minutes they talked about school concerts, nervous students, holiday performances, and funny classroom memories. Margaret's voice remained slow, but it carried warmth that had been missing earlier. She wasn't discussing medications, symptoms, or doctor's appointments. She was talking about the career that had once filled her life with purpose. Daniel listened quietly, realizing he had not heard his mother speak this much in weeks. Even Lily smiled as Grandma described children forgetting lyrics during concerts and proudly bowing to imaginary applause. Nearby passengers gradually stopped staring at Margaret's shaking hands. Instead, they listened to her stories. The aircraft doors closed with a quiet thud, and moments later the captain welcomed everyone aboard. Safety demonstrations began while the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Outside the window, airport vehicles moved steadily across the tarmac, their flashing lights reflecting against the airplane's polished wing. Margaret Parker sat quietly beside the window, her fingers trembling in her lap as they always did, but something inside her had changed since Emily had stopped to talk with her. The fear and embarrassment that had followed her through the airport were no longer the only emotions on her face. For the first time that day, there was also a hint of peace. Daniel noticed it immediately. He had spent years watching his mother's confidence slowly disappear after Parkinson's disease entered her life. Every public outing became another reminder of what she could no longer control. She had once been a woman who stood confidently in front of classrooms filled with energetic children, directing choirs with graceful movements and encouraging shy students to sing louder. Now she often apologized for things completely beyond her control, from shaking hands to slow steps. Watching Emily speak to her like an old friend instead of a burden had awakened something Daniel thought his mother had nearly lost. As the engine slowly increased in volume, Margaret looked toward Emily, who was helping another passenger a few rows ahead. She is very kind, Margaret whispered. Daniel smiled. She reminded everyone who you really are. Margaret looked down thoughtfully. I almost forgot. Daniel reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder. You've always been that person. Lily leaned across the armrest. I never forgot. Margaret's eyes filled with tears once again, but these tears were different. They carried gratitude rather than sadness. The airplane began moving away from the gate, rolling slowly toward the runway. Most passengers focused on their phones or stared through the windows. The businessman seated behind Daniel had remained unusually quiet ever since listening to Margaret describe her years as a music teacher. Earlier, he had been eager to change seats. Now he seemed deep in thought. After several minutes he leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me," he said softly. Daniel turned around cautiously. "Yes." The man looked embarrassed. "I couldn't help overhearing your mother's stories." Daniel nodded. The passenger looked toward Margaret. "My daughter just started teaching first grade last year." Margaret turned slowly to face him. "Really?" "Yes." He smiled awkwardly. "She says it's the hardest job she's ever loved." Margaret's tired face brightened. "Tell her, every child remembers one teacher forever." The man nodded. "I will." He hesitated before continuing. "And, I'm sorry." Daniel understood immediately. The apology wasn't only for asking to move seats. It was for making assumptions before knowing the woman sitting only a few feet away. Margaret smiled gently. "It's all right." "No," the man replied honestly. "It wasn't." Silence settled between them for a moment. Then Margaret surprised everyone. "My students taught me forgiveness every day." The businessman laughed quietly. "I suppose children are good at that." "They are." When the seat belt sign remained on during taxi, Emily walked through the cabin one final time, checking each row. As she reached Daniel's family, she noticed the conversation taking place. "Everything all right here?" the businessman answered before anyone else could. "Better than all right." Emily smiled without fully understanding. "I'm glad to hear that." Just then another passenger across the aisle, an elderly woman traveling alone, leaned toward Margaret. "I heard you taught music." Margaret nodded. "For many years. I was a librarian." Margaret smiled. "We probably helped the same children." The woman laughed warmly. "I imagine we did." Soon they were exchanging stories about school assemblies, noisy hallways, forgotten homework, and nervous children performing on stage for the first time. Daniel watched the conversation spread naturally across the row. People who had avoided eye contact during boarding were now smiling, asking questions, and listening with genuine interest. Even Lily proudly joined in. "My grandma sings better than anybody." Margaret chuckled. "I don't know about that." "It's true," Lily insisted. Emily overheard the comment while walking past. "I believe it." Several nearby passengers laughed softly. The atmosphere inside the cabin felt completely different from only half an hour earlier. Fear had given way to curiosity. Distance had become conversation. Judgment had quietly transformed into understanding. As the aircraft reached the runway, the engines roared with greater power. Everyone settled back into their seats while the plane accelerated toward the sky. Lily instinctively reached for her grandmother's hand. Margaret's fingers still trembled. They always would, but this time she wasn't trying to hide them. She simply held her granddaughter's hand and smiled. The airplane lifted smoothly from the ground, rising above the airport buildings and climbing into the wide blue sky. Daniel looked out the window before glancing back at his mother. For months he had worried only about reaching the medical treatment waiting at the end of their journey. Now he realized something equally important had already happened before the flight had truly begun. One person had chosen compassion over discomfort. That single choice had encouraged another. Then another. Until an entire section of strangers no longer saw a woman defined by Parkinson's disease. They saw Margaret Parker. A devoted mother. A beloved grandmother. A retired music teacher who had spent decades filling children's lives with confidence and song.